Tracey Bunda. I come from Ipswich. I grew up in Ipswich in Queensland, and my dad is Waka Waka. He comes from Cherbourg, and my mum comes from Stradbroke Island. She's a Noogie woman. If I think about when I made that choice to go into teaching, that was the latter part of the 70s. And there were a number of options available to women. One of them was nursing. You could not have to go to college or university at that particular time and go into the bank or go into teaching. And it was complex in the sense that I knew I didn't want to not do anything. I certainly didn't want to work in the bank, and I don't have the stomach for being a nurse. I praise nurses, but I don't have the stomach for it myself. And so I opted to go into teaching. And at that particular time, there was an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander teacher education program that was established at James Cook, or at that time Townsville College of Advanced Education. I went to the interview, I was accepted, and I just thought Townsville's far too far away for me from my family. So I came back and with the help of the Federal Department of Education, I got into Kedron Park Teachers College, as it was known at that time, but it's all amalgamated now, so it's known as QUT. And so I went straight from high school straight into Teachers College. And there was myself and one other Aboriginal person there. For some of the time, Davina Woods, she was a semester in front of me. And then towards the latter part of my study, there was another Aboriginal person there, Des Crump. And Des has gone on to study in special education. Davina's working in the university, and I'm working in the university as well. So it was really worthwhile, I think, to take up a teacher education qualification. At the end of that, I was offered to do a degree in law at University of Queensland, and I knocked it back. Shame. The dean at that particular time was in a wheelchair. He came out to my house in the wheelchair to ask me to go to university, and I said no, so he had to wheel himself back into the car and away. But at that particular time, you'd done 12 years of school, primary and high school, and 3 years of college, and I had just had enough. But it was also the embodiment of our old people who hadn't been able to receive an education. And that was a very, very strong story within my family, to be able to gain the tools of the coloniser, to begin to unpack the house of the coloniser. And so my mum and dad, who didn't receive very much education at all, made great investments in education. And to the point where I was, at high school, I was educated in a private school. They just saw that as the type of investment to be able to break the cycle that had been there for so many Aboriginal families, and saw education as a tool of power to be able to make change. So at the time, it's hard. You need to be able to make a decision for the rest of your life when you're 16 years of age. And you're never ever really quite sure whether or not you've made the right decision, Should I have gone off and done, I don't know, marine studies and, be swimming with the dolphins today? Yes, that would have been lovely, but, I made the choice that I did. And so in doing that, I invested myself in that particular choice as well. I can remember one class we had, it was a psychology class, and at that particular time there was much hoo-ha about, I suppose it was the beginnings of, what had been floating around in the 80s and 90s in terms of an Aboriginal learning style. And I can remember Des and I were sitting in this psychology class and taking great affront to this white man standing at the front of the lecture theatre talking about blacks, knowing that many of the white students in that particular class would use that terminology to refer to us as Aboriginal people, but not have a sense of, not have a critical sense of how that term of black was being used. So I can remember Des and I walked out, and I think we walked to the Dean of Students and said, either he changes his language or we're out of here. And we met with him, and he was very sensitive, and he didn't want to be affronting to us, but at the same time he recognised what we were saying, I mean, when you are training as a teacher, or when I was training as a teacher, you didn't have those Aboriginal references around you all the time, and you were selective about the type of Aboriginal references that you brought into the lecture or brought into the tutorial situation. And at the same time, you were making selections about, okay, what will I take on board here, but what won't I take on board so that I'm not becoming assimilated, that I'm not becoming white in this process, How do I celebrate myself, but how do other people, truly be respectful of me as an Aboriginal person? And so, there was always the inevitable, oh, but how are you Aboriginal, And they were always really difficult, and some days you could go through an educative process with those people who were asking the question, and other days you were just wild and you just said, go away. You don't know what you're talking about. So you had to look carefully and see whether or not those people who you were engaging with demonstrated aspects of where you were coming from as an Aboriginal person. And so, I was friends with, I can remember some of my colleagues being people who came from really large families, extended families. They understood that concept, the madness of large families and extended families. I was friends with people who were poor, and we're doing it tough by going to Teachers College. There weren't very many connections to, the upper class, white, aspiring, to be something. There weren't those sorts of connections. If I think about what my mum and dad were teaching me, in spite of the fact that it can be really, really difficult to be in a place like a teacher's college when you are the only Aboriginal person there. it was about perseverance, and it was about resilience. You know, if you think about their lives as Aboriginal people and what, you know, the rot that they had to put up with and how they came through that particular period, you know, like my mum was starved, you know, because she dared speak back in the mission situation. My dad was flogged because he dared run away, you know, he dared look for something better for himself, you know. So those sort of teachings go with you, you know, into those spaces, because those spaces can be, they can be unsafe. They can be risky spaces, you know. Unfortunately, you know, many of our students still find themselves, in 2012, find themselves in those spaces where they may be the only Aboriginal person in their tutorial. And for that, I have a lament that hasn't changed. But I think the other thing too that my mum and dad gave me was this really great sense of self and a great sense of humour. So even though you couldn't necessarily, I mean, the mob can always turn a really adverse situation into something funny. And so to be able to be with mob and laugh about those situations, you know, is really important to the soul. And, you know, the other thing that helped me, for a while I had my cousin at the same college. And so, you know, we were able to, you know, pack our little lunch in the morning and off we'd go to college and, you know, come back. So yeah. I suppose one of the things that I'm forever grateful about, when you finish your teacher training and then you hit the ground running, all of those skills that you have, you know, either through your training or through, you know, through yourself, you have to bring them to bear in the classroom situation, because there's, you know, 25 little faces looking back at you, expecting you to know what you're doing. And that's a good life skill anyway, you know. And I can always remember one of my first teaching situations, which was in the southern suburbs of Brisbane. There were two little boys in the class, and I made them my buddies. You know, they were my helper buddies in the classroom. And one of the other teachers, after a while, commented and said, "Oh, you have a really good relationship with those young boys." And I said, "Oh, yeah." And that teacher said to me, they were actually quite difficult boys. They were boys that ran away from school at lunchtime. They were boys who jumped out of windows to get out of the classroom. And so I felt really good about myself, that here I was with these two young fellas. I can remember that one of those young fellas, I mean, I think part of his resistance to schooling was that he didn't have literacy skills, and I taught him to read. And I remember this day when it was his turn to read, and he read a paragraph. You know, he wasn't fluent. He wasn't sophisticated, but, you know, he persevered and he got through and he read this paragraph. And all the other children in that particular reading group put down their books and clapped him. And his self-esteem just rose immeasurably, you know, on that day. And so his leadership then, as this little fella, then he took that from being naughty to caring about everybody else within the classroom. And after I After I finished, I only taught in that school for a little while, and I asked for a transfer to a country area outside of Brisbane, and this was a very religious community, very fundamental religious community, and up rocks the black girl to teach the apostolics and the fundamental Methodists, and it's sort of like that moment. Oh, here comes the teacher. Oh my God, the teacher is black, and but I had a really good time in that particular school. And one of the things, because kids become really attached to you as a classroom teacher, and one of the things that the kids did is they wouldn't wear sunscreen, and when the other teachers said, "Oh, you have to wear sunscreen if you're going to go out into the sun," and they said, "No, Miss Bunda doesn't, so I don't. I don't have to wear sunscreen." So I started wearing sunscreen then, so that these kids would also wear sunscreen so that they could go out and play. It was an interesting school, that particular school. It was a 2-teacher school. I was the other teacher with the principal. That was a fast learning curve. Country towns are small communities. Everybody knows your business, so everybody knew my business as the Aboriginal teacher. So if ever you felt like you were under surveillance anyway as an Aboriginal person, then that became hyper-surveillance in a small country town. I left there and went into the education department after a couple of years. I moved closer into town and taught in that school, and then I moved into the education department after that. So I think in total I did about 5 years of classroom teaching before I left. And I just wanted to say, at that, I was part of, with many other Aboriginal teachers being trained at that time, part of a movement from the National Aboriginal Education Committee, which looked for 1,000 teachers by 1990. And one of the things that was happening was that as Aboriginal people were being trained, then those people were being gobbled up into, other jobs apart from teaching. So that could have happened to me. It eventually did, but for the 5 years that I was in the classroom, I think there's some very good and very fond memories. There's some hardcore events as well, but if you want to have a teaching career, I think you need to have a very honest conversation with yourself. So, this sounds silly, but I think it's quite fundamental. You've got to actually like children. If you don't like children, then you shouldn't be a teacher. You should go and learn how to do IT, And I was blessed in the sense, because I was raised in an extended family, you had a whole range of people in a whole range of ages. And so you were always engaged with children in your family somewhere. I think too, if you think teaching's going to be an easy option, other than, say, a science degree, which might be considered a lot harder, I think you're fooling yourself. Once you make the commitment to teaching, it is quite intensive. You may think you're only there working from 9 till 3 and you have all of these school holidays. Well, yes, that's true, but you actually do quite a lot of work outside hours. And so if you know that you can put in that effort and energy to actually contribute something really important to the nation, and that's educating everybody's children, then, and not necessarily be seen or praised for it as well, then I think you should take on a teaching career. The pay's good now, I hear, much better than when I was. Gosh, I think my first annual pay was about $14,000. So, you know, you're not doing it for the money. It is a love job, and I think if you do make that commitment and if you do put in the effort, you have a very solid career ahead of you. One of the things that I had contemplated as well when I left the classroom and was in the education department was taking my teaching qualification overseas, and I had it all sorted so that I would be teaching in Canada. So it's the type of qualification that you can travel with, and it's a good passport in that respect. So you get to see the world and you get to see how other people live, and you become exposed to other teaching, which I think is always a really good thing. For me, you know, I took all of those teaching skills and I shifted it into higher education. I can always remember too my family saying, "Oh my God, she's here. She's going to organise us." So maybe that's a downside of being a teacher, is that you do have really great organisational skills, and other people don't necessarily see that as a great thing, but something that you're going to torment them with. Sometimes my family would say that. I now work at the Yungarendi Centre, First Nation Centre at Flinders University, and one of the tasks that we have is to teach into a compulsory subject in education, into the Bachelor of Education. And recently we've coupled that up with teaching into a Masters of Teaching as well. Now, if I could just deal with the notion of compulsory first, and I just want to relay back to the National Aboriginal Education Committee. And what the NAEC had set as policy was, at that time, Indigenous perspectives, you know, in courses throughout university, Teachers College. And the strategy to get 1,000 teachers by 1990 was a little bit of social engineering on our behalf, whereby we would begin to influence the next generation of white children, because mainly we teach white children, not Aboriginal children, unless you're in a high-density Aboriginal community. And so there was this impulse to ensure that every Australian got some education about Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander studies. And as we came into the higher education system, we made the argument for compulsory components of a degree. The degree does that anyway, you know. Sometimes it's the professional standard that dictates, you know, a student needs to learn this and this and this and this. So we piggyback onto that and made the same argument in terms of, in this case, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander education. Because it's highly likely that any classroom teacher during the course of their career will have to teach Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students. So what knowledge do you need to be able to have to be able to do that effectively. And so we teach this subject, compulsory subject, in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander education. And we expose the students to a number of critical theories. If the white students think they're going to rock up and they're going to learn Aboriginal culture, then, they're in for a shock. And they are. A lot of students are shocked about the knowledge that we provide. I find that very sad in 2012 that you would get a second-year university student who has very minimal education about Aboriginal people and who highly likely has not had any personal engagement with Aboriginal people. And so that speaks to me to the great distance between Aboriginal society and white society. It still remains. If the children of the white nation, suffer that non-engagement and that non-education. So the critical theories are quite difficult for the students to begin to understand. There is always a core group who resist the teaching of the subject, both in terms of its content, both as well as the fact that for the first time they have Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander lecturing authorities standing in front of them, giving them the knowledge. And some of that anger turns into guilt, and they become immobilised in terms of their own agency about what can they do and how can they do that. But usually by the end of the course, we've been able to engage in a process of transformation for most of the students. But during that semester, it is quite intense, it's burdensome when you are dealing with resistance, and that resistance is spoken as racism against you as the teacher, against the other Indigenous students within the class, their colleagues, and the racist resistance against the knowledge that is being learned. But I suppose in that respect, for those who are resistors and who don't change, then the fact that it is a compulsory subject, they need to comply. And that's quite an unusual situation for us to be in, where we're sort of determining what the compliance is rather than the other way around, which is usually the case. I think you need to be able to bring all of your teaching and all of your humanity to bear in those subjects, because, you deal with the resistor, you also deal with the one who wants to patronise you, you deal with the cannibal who wants to eat you, you deal with the negligent, the one who wants to make you invisible, can barely look at you, while you are teaching, and the deaf, and here I mean not somebody who is hearing disabled, but somebody who makes a selective choice that they don't want to hear what you want to say, what you have to say for their education. So there is that. But I think one of the really great strategies that we take on board at Yungarendi is that responsibility to teach these very, very large classes of non-Indigenous students, we have a strategy where we teach together, and that shared responsibility, but also that shared presence in a lecture theatre, that ability to be able to help each other in tutorials, I think that's a celebratory strategy. You know, that's a strategy of freedom for us. And it gives us, you know, we know then that when we stand there, when you stand in the lecture theatre and you stand behind the lectern, you don't stand alone. You stand with your mob. And I think that's very powerful, not only for the students but for us as well. I certainly know there are risks associated with our Aboriginal students doing that particular topic, because they meet the coalface in a totally different way to what we do. I mean, we have power in some respects and can utilise that power. Our students aren't as powerful. But certainly for the years that I've been teaching this subject, there is nothing more wonderful than to stand in a lecture theatre and see the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students sitting front and centre with the biggest smiles on their face, because they're really proud that here is a class where they know that their colleagues, their white colleagues, have to engage with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander teachers in a university setting. When you finish your initial teaching qualification, you're only limited by your imagination. So these days, often the Bachelor of Education degree is coupled up with another degree. And so you can go on and do further study at a master's level. You can go on again and do a professional doctorate or a PhD. You can go into the classroom, and you're not limited within Australia. We are a Commonwealth country, so there's your passport to the Commonwealth. But you can also move into management, public service. You can take your teaching career wherever you want to be able to take it. That's a really good thing about a teaching qualification. There are skills within that teaching qualification that other professions want. And depending on, if you've had the opportunity to be able to develop particular skills, within majors and minors, minor studies, you can follow those careers. So I don't think you should think, oh my gosh, I'm stuck in this classroom with these wild Brumby kids for the rest of my life. The world is your oyster. I suppose I know that best by my own career. When I finished in the classroom and moved into the education department, I was working in the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander education unit. And then, Aboriginal higher education was starting to develop. And so they needed a workforce. So some of the Aboriginal teachers that were trained in Queensland at that particular time moved into colleges of teacher education and universities. So that was a path I took. I didn't do it in Queensland. I did it outside of Queensland. I went to Victoria. For me, it was a really good move to make. I've still got my teaching skills, which I call upon and use them in my work, but I'm challenged by so many other aspects of my work, and I've learnt. I have now, other skills as well. God, this age, you'd hope so.